Hi everybody, welcome to our book launch this evening. I am very, very happy to welcome you to the launch of Thorpeness by Alison Brackenbury. I'm really pleased that you're joining us tonight. It's really cool to see where you're all watching from. Keep your messages coming in the chat. We love to hear from you throughout the event tonight. Tonight it is also another special occasion. I just want to wish happy birthday to Michael Schmidt. He's the founder and managing director of Carcanet Press. And it's his birthday, so happy birthday. Send him your birthday messages in the chat. It's really cool that we can celebrate two things at once this evening. But of course, the main event this evening is Alison Brackenbury and her new collection. So she's here, obviously, she's going to read to us in a little while. I'm just going to run over some housekeeping with you before I hand over. So we'll be together for about an hour as usual this evening. Obviously you found the chat, keep your messages coming in there. Please make sure that you select everyone on the drop down menu so that everyone else can read your messages, otherwise they might get a bit lost in there otherwise. During Alison's reading, I will, as usual, have the text up on screen as a visual guide for you. You're in control of that. If it's not to your liking, just have a play around with the settings and see if you can make it fit your needs. If you have any technical issues, also put those in the chat for us and we'll see what we can do to help you throughout the event. We are also joined by David Clarke. We're very grateful to have him here. He's going to be chatting to Alison later on in the event, and there'll also be some time for some audience questions. So as well as the chat box, please find a different button which says Q&A, and if you get your questions lined up in there, then David can put them to Alison later on in the event. So I'll introduce David and we'll begin the event properly. David Clarke is the winner of a Michael Marks Award, and he's the author of two collections which are both out with 9 Artists Press. The latest is called Europeans and it came out in 2019, so go and check his work out if you don't know it already. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome David on screen with me.
Thanks, Jasmine. It's really great to be here to celebrate Alison's launch. I have the honour to introduce her to you, although I know that many of you will be very familiar both with Alison, the person, and Alison, the poet. But just to give you a little bit of an introduction to her work and to Thorpeness. Alison, as many of you know, is from Lincolnshire. She was born in Gainsborough in 1953 and read English at St Hugh's College, Oxford, before working as a librarian and then as a part-time accounts and clerical assistant. But from 1990 until her retirement in 2012, she was a director and manual worker in the family metal finishing business, which is not something many poets can say about themselves. She's married with 1 daughter and lives in Gloucestershire. She's published 10 collections of poetry with Carcanet, as well as 2 volumes of selected poems, the most recent of which was Gallop in 2019. Her first book, Dreams of Power, was a poetry book society recommendation, and Skies was chosen by The Observer as one of its poetry books for the year for 2016. Her book of poems and recipes, Aunt Margaret's Pudding, was published by Happenstance in 2018. Alison's been awarded a Gregory Award and a Chumley Award by the Society of Authors for her work. And for over 30 years, her poems have appeared in Britain's major poetry journals. She's written reviews of poetry for a wide range of publications, and her work has frequently featured on radios 3 and 4. She's written 6 full-length radio features, including Singing in the Dark, about the stubborn survival of traditional song, which was a Radio Times choice. She contributes regularly to Radio 4's arts programme Front Row, and her work has been read. She's read her work live on Radio 4's Today programme. Alison is noted for her interest in promoting poetry on the internet, and many of us will be familiar with her posts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, especially lovely images of nature, particularly her own garden that she shares. Writing in The Guardian, Charles Bainbridge observed that Alison's poetry is characterised by a concern with stillness and natural detail, by a closeness to the ballad form, and, most of all, by a quiet lyricism and delight that is constantly being challenged, constantly under threat. Kate Kellaway in the same newspaper wrote, Alison Brackenbury's poetry is hospitable, open to all. And many of us who know Alison through poetry events in the UK will also have experienced the hospitality and support she extends to other writers. They'll also know just how captivating Alison is as a performer of her own work, which she performs for me very bravely, by heart. It's an absolute pleasure and an honour to introduce her reading this evening and to celebrate the launch of her wonderful new collection, Thorpeness. In this collection, Alison ranges across great spans of human history, from the Scythians to the Apollo space program, from the Anglo-Saxons to Jimi Hendrix, all with an immediacy that conjures emotional and physical worlds with the most skillfully observed details. The poems in this collection, as throughout Alison's work, also have a fully realized sense of place and time and an understated music that drives home their emotional truth. We're going to have a little time to discuss the book with Alison after her reading, as Jazz mentioned, and please do put your questions in the Q&A box. But I'm not going to say any more now. All that really remains for me to do is to ask Alison to step up to the virtual microphone and to read for us.
Thank you, David. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you very much to you all for coming, to Carcanet for present help, and to Michael for so many years of support. Happy birthday, Michael. First, I must apologise for the hat. It was my gardening hat. The hat is delighted by its promotion and almost runs to the computer every time I log into Zoom. I do hope to go back to my young hairdresser and get the latest bulletin on her new cat. Meanwhile, at least the hat is happy. We begin with a ditch. It is high on a hill in Gloucestershire, the county where I have lived for over 40 years. It is a green hollow among beechwoods, but like much in England, it is deceptive. For this place was a hill fort, and hill forts were a mistake. Excavations show that they ended in disaster. This hilltop, hauntingly, has never been excavated. I came here first on the warm and dangerous back of the small, sturdy horse I bought with my savings when I was 28. He was utterly loyal and lethally spooky. Some people think that horses see ghosts, and he seemed to think there were a few up on that hilltop. I thought of telling you the date when the poem was written, but I think you may agree that there are many years to which it could belong. The poem's title is the name of this haunting place, Norbury. I was almost hurled in the ditch, for my first mad pony would switch from gallop to halt in one stride. Each ride he would swerve, fling me back to the deep tumbled gorge by the track. Dark beech trees hung on each side. A hill fort, no life but its name, Norbury, marked Iron Age. The same June wind conjured sweat, flies, of course. I soothed the tossed, sun-bleached mane down by the dyke, rough grave to the town, bones of child, wrecked fighter, horse. What are 20 years to hill wind? I trudge, horses outlived. I find the highest beech drought-struck. A rich crest springs, orange fungus. Its throat gapes to the war trumpet's long note. The lost leader's last lying, which tumbled us all in the ditch. I did not grow up amongst the ditches of Gloucestershire, but in Lincolnshire. This book is home to a small village of poems dedicated to my grandmother, Dorothy Eliza Barnes. When I knew Dot, as she was called by her family, she was a Lincolnshire shepherd's wife, but As a young woman, she had been an Edwardian professional cook. She left a black oilskin notebook filled with her handwritten recipes. Here is what you will find on the very first page. The poem is called Start. Page 1, and Margaret's pudding. Take 1/2 pound of flour, 3 ounces lard or butter, egg, milk, sugar, baking powder. Spread jam in basin, summer gleam. Poke fire. For 90 minutes, steam. Dot took for granted custard seas in which all pudding swam, yellow as straw, farm workers' food. In frost, the men tramped home, moon glittered. No one knew how lard would line and leave their arteries hard. When I came home and you worked late, our workshop gloomed with cold. I bought flour from the corner shop, sacked cupboards for old bowls. Softly, the mixture dropped. I too spooned Margaret's hot jam sponge for you. Both my grandmothers were fine cooks and even better neighbours, but there was one item which neither of them ever made. The poem is called High Class Food. Both my grandmothers were of age to stuff fat sausages with sage, Lincolnshire's herb, which calms the blood. They could make dumplings sweet with suet, slash egg white with a knife till thick, plate shoulder poised, Victorian trick, but never dreamed of needing bread. They ran to bakers' vans instead. Yet, when strange men tramped round the farms to beg for work in 30 storms, Dot, between her jobs, would pour them tea beside her fire before sending them out in rain, well fed on home-cured bacon and white bread. Now, a short seasonal poem based on an unexpected taste on a rare return trip. The poem is called Lincolnshire Water. Here is strong land whose grass does not spill foaming milk, where I still hear in February taps hiss cold silk. Life has its seasons. Although as an adult I moved into a town, for 35 years my shaggy and unaffordable ponies lived on the Gloucestershire hills on a friend's farm, where I could ride in the lanes and in the wet woods. This is the last and perhaps most beautiful of our horses, who lived to be 31. But while I was deciding, finally, that I no longer wanted to risk my ribs to gallop, our last pony was losing her sight. This poem is called Going to the Yard on May the 19th. I will stumble up the paddocks where first mist blinds the air, past the crowds of nettles, the bonfire piled with chairs. She sleeps foursquare, alone, as she must be. Startled in sun, her ears search dusk for me. I buckle the head collar, her steps slow. She cannot glimpse hard gates I do not own. Summer's red coat gleams down her shoulder blade. She rests her head on me while I brush hard, greets her filled bucket with quick toss of head. The yard's one robin flits to her spilt food. Horses stand quiet when fed. She stares at skies. No spring sun melts the cataracts from our eyes. I click my tongue. Each calm hoof lifts. Too soon I clean each tender frog, the soul's half moon. 23 years, her breath on my neck. Then the vet must come at 10:30. Next, perhaps the most sombre poem in this reading. I should add that I am still not without hope, but I was sobered to realise that it was 50 years since the glowing picture of our Earth was captured in space. I first saw it when I was a generally optimistic schoolgirl. I then bought it on a poster for the technical college, where in my 20s I worked as a librarian. This is how it came back to me one morning before dawn in my 60s, when the BBC Six Music DJ, Chris Hawkins, mentioned on air that he planned to make a music feature based on the photograph. Chris later broadcast the poem I wrote that morning, so it is gratefully dedicated to him. The poem is called Apollo, 1968. They floated past the moon without a spark of radio, the quiet before birth. Pulsed by its cobalt seas, they watched the earth, its perfect O, rise trustful from the dark. As we wish children might, without a mark. See South America, whose tides of white shield sloths, jeweled hummingbirds, which drink our light. I was too young, sucked into my own dark. At work in a tech library, an arc of students, I set blue earth on the wall, so it sailed to them, bold and beautiful. In drawers, the plans for wind power slept in dark. The blue sea rose, then drowned. We lost the lark. I never dreamed that we would reach such dark. Now, I think we should have a tiny poem for this season and for a very different planet. The poem is called March the 4th. I heave back the bathroom window. The catch is stiff and, like me, old. I would like to let in the crescent moon. She is so slender and must be cold. And now I think it is time to climb on a bus again in the sun. The poem is called Wednesday on the 97. Like family you complain about, but love, I am at home with buses. This is prompt. At every stop it dawdles in the sun. I do not phone, read, talk. I simply sit. I watch deep sycamores dip to the south, as if the whole day is a cat that purrs, and I, the tongue, vibrating in its mouth. There is a less welcome sun in my next poem. Its subject came from the ancient nomadic tribe of the Scythians from Siberia. I went to an exhibition expecting to be enthralled by Scythian gold work. But my eye was caught by a very different object. The poem is called Scythian Ice Burial. Sheepskin, goatskin, kidskin, sable. Underneath a warrior's shoulder lay the child's coat, unable to heat or thaw his grave's cold power. Were small sleeves patched for him, a son, fevered in one summer hour. They laid him carefully, in trust no spade could lever earth's cold lid, no sun would pierce ground's frozen crust. The glacier shrinks like all he did, leaves his first coat our last ice hid. Sheepskin, goatskin, sable, kid. Charles Dickens, I think, would have been fascinated by the ice burials. In 2019, before travel stopped, I went to see the house, which was the home of Catherine and Charles Dickens in the early days of their marriage. I was startled to find that this modest building is Dickens' only surviving London house. I began to think about his long and changeable life and marriage. Before I read the poem, set in that London house, I must bombard you with facts, some of which I learnt on my visit. In 1851, under the name of Lady Maria Clutterbuck, Catherine Dickens published a book of meal plans. What shall we have for dinner? Is She His Wife? Is the title of an early play by Charles Dickens. Dickens had a desk built for his reading tours. When illness forced him to stop, he planned to burn this. Catherine and Charles Dickens had 10 children. Dickens separated from his wife in 1858. In the last years of his life, he had a secret relationship with a young actress, Ellen Ternan. I have no more to say is the final sentence of a letter from Dickens to his publishers, Evans and Bradbury. He quarrelled with them over their support for Catherine. The poem is called Charles Dickens at Home. Bombs, cranes made his grand houses mere rubble under feet, but not their narrow first door, 48 Doughty Street. Kind Catherine clasped the baby. Dickens set up his desk. He rattled sherry bottles. She counted out the eggs. The basement stairs could break knees. Her belly twitched, stretched sore. Charles stared across the garden. Oliver asked for more. Slowly, Kate shuffled menus, sweet salvage of her life. What shall we have for dinner? He wrote, is she his wife? Spring soup, then vermicelli, the hospital fund, grey curls, oxtail, mock turtle, hare soup, the house for fallen girls. His favourite child was Katie, who painted, laughed, dared turn to snatch the fragile reading desk her father chose to burn. Behind his tallest last house, with Catherine packed away, he lit his bundled letters. I have no more to say. The profile of his actress shows tension, sharp-lipped grace, not Catherine's muddled rings, not unlike Katie's face. We live in all our houses, ash whispers to the sleet, lime buds tap bedroom windows, upstairs in Doughty Street. And now, a much shorter poem about a man who was never famous. He was one of the many farm workers in the Lincolnshire village where I grew up, but he lived surrounded by a strange glow of mystery and of respect. The poem is called Fern. Does anyone wear buttonholes? We made them for the village fete. So I was sent up to the gate of the old man who would have gone to grammar if they could have bought a crested cap, soft shoes for sport. He passed from village desk to farm. The one girl he had waited for ran to an airman in the war. His sister kept the tiny house, a courteous, clever man, all said. In June heat, at a long lane's end, through the blue gate, on a grass path, I stepped beneath the roses' cloud. I saw him bend to stakes, head bowed, by billows of asparagus fur, for farmhand's collar or the queen, webbed, spread like hands, its tiny veins, crisp as dead leaf, all green, so green. I think that many of us recently discovered a small green kingdom close to our home. I spent a lot of time on a footpath in a field just outside Cheltenham. Here I found the shells of oysters, a cheap food in Victorian England, and I found willow pattern, the china which tells the story of two lovers, one rich, one poor. After death, the lovers are reunited as birds. The poem is called Willow Pattern. Town's edge, a lane, a bridge, a field, marched by the battered stumps of maize, lit by hills broad as the moon. The cracks in April's clay will yield rich oyster shells to feed poor days, pipes, pig skulls. Best we find soon smashed pottery, and most is blue, slipped from quick hands, a child's, a maid's, to floor. Were harsh words spoken? I brush a lattice rim, while you scoop one white scrap whose two blue birds, smudged lovers, soar, unbroken. When I wrote my penultimate poem, I had only seen its subject twice near Oxford, but there is a happy postscript. Although I grew up in a village, I now live in a town. In its green belt, yards from houses, over a murky stream, I saw this stunning bird again. The poem is called Flash. In Kenya, to bleached branch it came, noon's bird, malachite, kingfisher, even the broad beak borrowed flame. At Rujan was the Charwell there, with friends who later trekked through hell, sun's amber, fallen skies, lit air. Near Oxford, by the stained canal, your latest love turned unkind. You watched rainstorms fade, wings burned, banks blue. When the drab days unwind you, do not put streams behind you. Wait for the light to blind you. We began with a ditch. Let's end with the sky and with the book's title. Thorpeness is a small village built ruinously as an eccentric holiday resort at the beginning of the last century. It is just along the coast from Aldborough, which I love and visit every year. This journey brings me back to the East Coast, to the south of my grandmother's coastal birthplace, where I meet again my old and fearsome friend, the North Sea. But when I wrote the final poem in this collection, I had never been to Thorpeness. It had become the place I was meant to go to, but never reached. I think perhaps we may all have a Thorpeness. So here is the last poem of this new book and of my reading. The poem is called Shingle. Will I get to Thorpeness? Well, not today. Since my feet clash the beach the other way, a young brown gull veers, pipes its thin cry of distress. All the bright screens cry rain. A mermaid's purse, a black pouch lies, fish eggs that deep sea nursed. Vainly I skim it back. Rain beats my nose and chin. In tall streets, low clouds press. 3 swallows snatch, a gust, a breath, last fly. Small voices catch, Land's End, Storm's Edge, whirl high. Far, far beyond, Thorpeness. Thank you very much for listening.
And thank you, Alison, for that beautiful reading of beautiful poems. I'm going to, on behalf of the 118 people in the audience, I'm going to give you some applause there. Before we get into a couple of questions from me, just a reminder to everybody that you can put your questions into the Q&A for Alison, and I'll field those to her. Please do put them in the Q&A box, though. If you put them into the chat, they will get lost and I won't see them. And I think, Alison, you also had a message for the audience that you wanted to share.
Oh, yes.
To the questions.
Lovely. Thank you, David. Yeah, I wanted to explain a couple of things. First, as I've mentioned to David, I wanted to make an apology and an offer to you, our kind audience. If you're a poetry organizer, you may have encountered the poet who, at the end of the evening, beams at you, then walks off, leaving their book, their coat, and quite possibly their brain. I am that poet. So if I don't get round to a question, or I answer really ineptly, don't hesitate to get in touch with me afterwards. You can always contact me via the contact page on my website. I wanted to say one more thing, which I did not mention to David, because he would have tried to stop me. Although we both grew up in Lincolnshire, and we both now live in Gloucestershire, I do not know David because of place, but because of the excellence of his poetry. I was judging anonymous entries for a competition when I read one poem of compelling authority. It was very well written, but I was particularly struck by this short poem's echoing sense of a wider world. The poem was, of course, by David Clarke. So I warmly recommend David's latest collection, The Europeans from 9 Arches. Do look, David knows this is my favourite, do look for the school foreign exchange trip. I've never been on one of these, but you may begin to feel you have been on one. It's ruefully funny, but it ends with a restless sense of change and of hope. I hope you'll share it. And now I look forward very much to sharing some ragged thoughts with you and with David.
Thank you, Alison. It's very, very generous of you. You know, I've like everybody else, I've been really enjoying these poems, and I've had the privilege of seeing them a little bit in advance and being able to think about them in more depth. One of the things that struck me about the book was that you have quite a number of shorter poems in it. You read one of them today, March the 4th, and quite often these poems are sort of like little, maybe like diary entries or little moments that just kind of stand on their own. And, you know, as a writer, I'm asking very selfishly here for my own purposes, I often feel not kind of brave enough to just leave a poem as a short poem and think that's doing all it needs to do. So is that something that you've become more confident in doing throughout your writing career, of just allowing a short poem to be a short poem?
I think so. I think when you're young and you're conscious of the great poems of English literature, it's tempting to think that's where I want to go. It's like having the mountain in the distance. But I did become aware that this doesn't suit all poets. Keats tried to write a mythological epic called The Fall of Hyperion. He never finished that. What he did finish was the Ode to Autumn, and that shorter poem has figures like the gleaner, the collector of grain, the poorest of the poor. And these figures have a strange beauty and dignity. I think the gods of Hyperion became the gleaner in the Ode to Autumn. But I was lucky, I think, through school anthologies, I had encountered very effective short poems. I'd like to recite one by Kipling, which you may know, Rudyard Kipling, On a Dead Statesman. I could not dig, I dared not rob, therefore I lied to please the mob. Now all my lies are proved untrue, and I must face the men I slew. What tale shall serve me here among mine angry and defrauded young? I am glad to say I've never had Kipling's personal reasons for the cold fury that went into those lines. But I think when you read that when you're young, you do realise what a short poem can do. There's only 6 lines in that poem. As you say, I tend to go even shorter. I think the quatrain is useful. But there's one practical point about these poems, David. I don't know if you'll find that, because I know you have a busy working life, as so many of us do. I find in my case, the short poems go past in the air like motes in the sunlight. And where there's something there, there's a subject, but unless I get them down straight away, they are gone. I shall just get a drink of water and return to my camera. You can see all the China horses, memories of my obsessions. And so working is a real disaster for these poems, because I think most of us now can't stop and write a poem. And you refer to my metal finishing days, when you're standing with a 2-kilo oiled bit of beautifully honed metal, and there's a driver pacing up and down the pavement outside, smoking, waiting to get back to the West Midlands. You can't get them down. I did write one at work called Species, which is one of my most polemic poems about extinction. So one of the great things about, inverted commas, retirement is that your cat and your house may moan a bit, but if you drop everything and run off and write a poem, you probably won't get the sack. So I think we all have short poems to look forward to. Yeah,
it's a much neglected aspect of the poet's life, isn't it? The other things they're doing with their time and the space that is there for poems to actually be written down. Very different from the novelist's life, I think.
Indeed.
Returning to the idea of the snapshot, we haven't got any questions from the audience as yet. I'm sure they'll come, but I notice in a lot of these poems you're able to cover like quite amazing stretches of time. You know, the Norbury poem that you started off the reading with there, you're talking about a particular moment, but you're managing to insert it into this kind of overarching historical narrative, and that's something I'm very much familiar with from your earlier work. Could you tell us something a bit about how you approach narrative in your poems?
Well, I've become conscious recently, David, that I really did come from a background of stories, and the older you get, I'm really playing the age card for what it's worth, because my teeth are about 83, so I think, you know, I'm going to make the best of being in my 60s. So I think that our stories are more complicated than we even know. If you ever get one of those DNA test things done, it's fascinating. I was very proud of my Welsh parentage, because there was a story about that, my Welsh ancestry. My grandfather said a farm boy had walked across the border from Monmouthshire into England, which could not have happened before the beginning of the 19th century, interestingly enough. So there was Welsh blood. But suddenly on the DNA test, there's significant Scottish blood, which I think is wonderful. But where did that come from? Marion Gateshead, who knows? But I think it might have come from a grandmother of mine, my mother's mother, who was a great storyteller. And she would sit rather regally in her chair, because sadly she was lame, and say, "I always remember." And I grew up with these stories. My father's family were quieter, but they were terrific mimics. They listened to people. They could remember every word. They could mimic their employer's upper class voice perfectly. I'm sure he couldn't mimic theirs. So all that was there. And I now feel rather guilty, because perhaps in my 20s, I encountered the alternative ending, these intense short fragments of prose. I was very seduced by all this. And then I think it struck me eventually, perhaps sitting on a bus, that what we really want to store is if someone's sitting near you on the bus and is telling you about their feud with their sister-in-law and they get off and you haven't heard the end, you feel so cheated. So I think in a sense, I went back to my inheritance. One huge help was my obsession with English folk song, because ballads are terrific storytellers, and there are some very sort of simple but effective tricks. There's the one of using a proper name at the beginning of the poem in one sense, and then the name meaning something very different at the end. As people who love folk music may know, the great Norma Waterson died recently, and I heard a recording of her singing a song called The Bay of Biscay, which I wasn't very familiar with. And at the beginning, the Bay of Biscay is simply the place to which the lover is very inconveniently sailing. But at the end, the Bay of Biscay is, I think, definitely death, the country of the dead. In between, by the way, the lover has reappeared overnight, because for those of you who might think, I can see why, that English folk song is all fa la la, it's actually very often death, sex, or a combination of the two. But Edward Thomas had picked up the use of proper names in English folk song. I think I'm only beginning to scratch the surface of what you could do with this, but I think I do commend song as a source of storytelling.
Fantastic. Yes, that's definitely very, very palpable in your work. And actually, we've got a little flurry of questions have come in. Some of them picking up on those ideas around song and folk song in particular. So we've a question here from Adam Crothers, a very beautifully formulated question. Alison,
yes.
For all your gorgeous, chiming and decisive closure, and for all their disarming sincerity, your poems never sound pat or simplistic or naive. Do the rhymes and beats and wonder ever threaten to tip the poem in draft into platitude? If so, what's your process of correction? And there's quite a number of questions that have come through in the chat as well about the role of rhyme and meter in your work. So perhaps we could sort of roll those into that question from Adam about, you know, does the rhyme and meter ever send you to the wrong place, and how do you correct that? Yes,
well, I think I live in perpetual danger of falling into total platitude, but I think I can only say in my defense that some of the poets I admire most, like Keats and so on, I think do operate sometimes on quite a dangerous knife edge. And Keats was constantly told in his lifetime by reviewers that in his youthful verse he'd gone over the edge. So I think a desire to, in a sense, be clear in some ways can reduce you to saying things which are once worked but have gone dead, which perhaps is what a platitude is. The rhymes, I don't know. I think one of their main functions is memory. And perhaps in the end, even when you're revising stuff, you get bored with remembering something that's too obvious. So I think sometimes the rhymes might save me. The real trouble, as we all know, is how many rhymes are there for death in English? Breath, you know. So I think, if not platitude, rhymes can force you into certain channels. That's a real worry. And sometimes you have to ditch that particular rhyme to have a fresher thought. But yeah, there's a kind of war going on there, I think, constantly. I'm sure, like most poets, I love the clever lyricists like Stephen Sondheim. I could listen to those songs all night, not so much for the melody, but how do the Americans rhyme as they do? And I agree with Adam, it's a kind of opening up.
Yes, there's that kind of rhyme for surprise, isn't there? Which lyricists like sometimes do very well, and Paul
and avoids the danger that Adam flags up. Yeah.
Catherine Alderman, who we both know from Cheltenham, is asking a little bit about your process. So, what is it that you, when you feel like writing something, what exactly happens? And you know, what is that moment? Can you talk about that moment when you feel this has to be written down, and how does that work?
Well, there are two different ones. One is the, oh my goodness, it has to go down. Those are the kind of poems you write in green felt tip pen on the back of your daughter's revision book or something. I think I've got one of those. Actually, the great Jenny Joseph, who some of us may have known, I think wrote some Warning, which haunted her for the rest of her life, the purple poem, on the back of an envelope. And so it's interesting that things you write like that. I've had things praised very kindly for subtlety, which I actually wrote at the bus stop. That's one kind of poem. But I do actually have a regular time for writing, usually first thing in the morning. And I do have some subjects lined up I want to write about. And then there are conscious choices about which form shall I use. I think there, especially with age, it's more a question of whether I run out of energy before the end. It's not so much losing the whole thing as a kind of inertia. But after all that, certainly the formal ones from the mornings have many drafts. Some of the ones that drop out of the air do not have so many drafts, but they're very hard to judge, I find. They just arrive saying sort of, here I am. And then you probably have to ask other people. In fact, to go back to Adam's query, I think other people tell you, if they're honest, when you're committing platitudes. We all have slightly blinkered vision of our own work, unfortunately.
Yes, it's a difficult thing, isn't it, distinguishing between something which is the truth and something which is a platitude. Okay, so we've got a question on a slightly different tack from Joan Hewitt, who says, wonderful reading, Alison. I'm 76. Are there any younger poets you admire particularly?
Gosh, well, I could sit here all evening. I always feel so bad when I do this because I sort of forget all the people I wanted to praise. Helen Morton Kim Moore, I've been lucky enough to know, are people who interest me very much. I would say in general that I think young poets write so well. I mean, this may be partly to the credit of creative writing courses. And I'm also immensely impressed by people's commitment. Kate Tempest, who obviously crosses many paths, was actually somebody I thought about a lot. I saw Kate in the early days. She's a very humble person anyway, I think, but she was far less well known then. And the commitment of this young woman to learning the work, I began to think about the amount of effort that's involved. She's also involved in musicians and so on. And I began to feel that I'd led a different sort of life, that I'd been rather dilettante about the way I presented it. I think I learned a lot from Kate. So in general, in this dark world and these are dark times, I can honestly say, I've said in print, that I think the excellence of young poets is a great inspiration, and I'm wholly capable of nicking their verse. I'm sure a lot of you have read Hannah Lowe's Kids with the admiration I have, and the subtlety of those sonnet endings, the rhyme schemes by Hannah, I shall be nicking some as soon as possible. I have no qualms in stealing the stanzas of my betters, but yes, I think sort of scanning the magazines will throw people up, and I'm sure as soon as this ends, I will think of dozens of people I wished I'd mentioned. But I'm always buying pamphlets. I think pamphlets are a wonderful entry into work, and there's some great pamphlet work around by new poets.
Yes, it's interesting what you're saying there, Alison, that it's as part from learning from the techniques of others, sort of learning also from their approach to be, I suppose, to being a poet, is not just to the writing itself. You mentioned there darkness and difficult times, and you know, your poems quite often face those things very courageously. I think we have a question here from Julia Smith about you know, the safe space of poetry which we're occupying at the moment, and the safe space of the Zoom room, and she's asking there about how poetry can bear witness to these very difficult times, and I guess by extension also some of the other issues that you address in your work, for instance the climate crisis and so on, which is a constant reference point for you in recent work. Yes,
indeed. I think I don't have an overall answer for this, because I think people have different approaches, and one thing I wish we were better at doing now as poets is writing, how can I put this, more general poetry. If you think about the popular poets of the early 20th century. I've sat in a cafe at Aldborough and heard someone who I think was a builder talking about how he loved the poem about being master of your fate and captain of your soul. And he had this poem near his bedside and read it every night. And actually, I'm moved by that poem. And it's an interesting historical thing, which I won't go into. I think it partly involves the First World War, that we seem slightly to have gone away from that ability to write. So I think in theory, you could write about it in a very moving but general way. I hope poets won't take this amiss. I think songwriters are sometimes better at this in our generation. Personally, I tend to have to find something to focus on, and it might even be something from the past. I thought today, is my reading, in a sense, has it got any connection with what's happening? And I thought, well, in a sense, my wars are the wars of the past, and they're always present. I knew a lot about the First World War from my grandfather, for example, but I think some people may be better than I am, I know they are, of, say, reading something in a newspaper and in a very deep and meaningful way, turning that into a poem. It's something personally I probably couldn't do, but I've read very fine polemic work. Because Martin Newell a few years ago used to write, and there'd be furious poems in the middle of the Iraq War, because he'd obviously been so moved by something he'd read in the paper. So I think there are ways of doing it, but I think we all have different ways. And I shall wait to see. Somebody did ask me the other day if I had a poem, and I thought, well, I don't have a new one, but I think they will be there. It's one of those sad things, isn't it, that poetry, in a sense, flourishes in dark times. There is the singing, as Brecht said, but you wouldn't want that occasion for poetry. You really wouldn't.
Indeed, yes, and I think it can also be the case of that kind of public poetry that what works in the moment, poets don't necessarily feel is their finest work later. I know that so Auden's poem about 1939, the outbreak of the Second World War, was one he eventually disowned and wouldn't have in his collected poems at all. We have probably got just time for one more question. And we've got a couple of questions here about form, and interesting from Denny Turpin and Judy Corran, and they come from opposite directions. One is asking, does the poem dictate the form? And the other is asking, does the form, is this form something the poem chooses, if you see what I mean?
Yes, well, perhaps I can share something wonderful which taught me a lot from Tom Gunn. I think it was in a radio interview where he's talked about consciously playing form against subject. And there was a heartbreaking poem by Gunn about his mother's suicide, which is one of the sort of tightest, most formal poems I can remember in his output. But I think it works so well, and possibly he could write it because he fed the pain of the children to what himself and his brother through what are very musical lines. And I think that's something I realized rather late. I think some people are brilliant at matching form and subject, a fluent poem about an otter. I think personally I'm better in an inferior way at following what Gunn did, that you set the form against the subject. I sort of mentioned that as a possibility. I think in my own case, there are two possibilities. I think I mentioned there's the back of the envelope poems, and I think they're choosing their form, they're just dropping out the air. But the ones I write on a Friday morning, I do sit down and think, well, should I try this as a sonnet? And you can get it wrong. You can feel the thing hasn't worked in some way because of the form. So yes, I think, the questions are right to think there's some sort of very interesting but slippery relationship between the germ of this thing and what you're trying to put it in. It's a very interesting business.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think I've more or less managed to cover all of the at least the areas that people were asking about. There's a couple of questions we haven't managed to get to, but time is pressing, and Alison's kindly offered to answer questions, I think, for those who want to get in touch with her. So I'm going to hand over, I think, now to you, Alison, to introduce some videos.
Oh, yes. Yes. Thank you so much, David, and the questioners. Yes, do go to the contact page on my website. We'll correspond. Yeah, I'm delighted to introduce two short final videos recorded especially for you by a superb young Scottish singer called Iona Fife, spelled F-Y-F-E. The first is of a song, surely one of poetry's favourite cousins. Reactions to voices are very personal, but I find Iona's singing mesmerising in its lovely intensity. She's recently won a major music award. I urged her to say something about her work at the beginning of this video because she lost all her live gigs and income at the beginning of the pandemic and has recently had more gigs cancelled. Iona kindly recorded a song from her repertoire, which you may know very well, but which was a moving and gracious discovery for me. It is called The Parting Glass. I do hope you feel tonight, as the song says, that you have spent your silver in good company. So here is our penultimate item, The Parting Glass, introduced and sung by Iona Fife.
A huge thanks to Alison for asking me to be part of her poetry book launch. I'm sure it's going to do really well. Please do keep up with my music on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, YouTube, whatever. There's some CDs for sale on Bandcamp too, full band CDs, not just me and the piano. And of course, get yourself a poetry book. This song is called The Parting Glass, and it's a song that went from Scotland to Ireland and to England, and there's loads of different versions, but the melody seems quite Irish. It's really bonny, so please a wee glass. And
you are a poet. How would you end an evening? Which of your own poems would you choose? I was deep in the ditch of uncertainty when Iona rescued me. She is a singer deeply drawn to words and poetry. I do urge you afterwards to rush off to YouTube and listen to Iona singing Violet Jacobs' poem of longing, The Wild Geese. I had asked Iona to say something about her fearless campaigning for the Scots language, and she did, but in a separate video, having read one of my poems, then translated it with wit and sensitivity into Scots. Her reading is a reminder from a fine musician how musical words can be. And as I listened, the lightness of some of those words, with for with, brought back to me the softness of my Lincolnshire grandparents' voices. I feel we have come full circle. So, with heartfelt thanks to all who have helped and all who have listened tonight, here is our last item, the last poem from Thorpeness, read in Scots by Iona Fife.
I thought that I would translate the poem Thorpeness that Alison sent over to me into Scots, and it really goes well over, and it totally reminds me of Violet Jacobs' poetry. It's just beautiful. Will I get to Thorpeness? We'll nae the day. Sign my cabs clash a beach the other way. A young brown gull veers, pipes its thin cry of distress. Ah, the bricht screens cry rain, a mermaid's purse, a black pooch lees fish eggs that deep sea nursed. Vainly I skim it back, rain beats my nib and chin. In tall streets, low clouds press, three swallows snatch, a gust, a breath, last flee. Sma vices catch Lawn's end, storm's edge whirl high, far, far ayont Thorpeness. I hope that I have not taken your words completely out of context, but I thought it'd be nice just to put it into Scots, which is one of three national languages that we have in Scotland. We've got English, Gaelic and Scots is the West Germanic one, and Doric is a dialect of Scots, so you know, folk speak differently in Glasgow as they would for Orkney or Aberdeenshire or Shetland, and I guess my dialect is a mix between Doric and Glaswegian. So yeah, I hope that you enjoyed that wee bit of Scots.
Thank you guys so much for joining us at this launch this evening. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks to Alison for the beautiful reading, and thank you to David for hosting so graciously. I'm putting the link in the chat box for you. There's a code. The code to get your discount off the book is Brackenbury Launch. It will come as an email, an automatic email from Zoom tomorrow, but you can do that now from the chat if you'd also like to do that immediately. If you can't find the email or the link, just get in touch with us and we'll help you. But please do go and buy a copy of the book. We would really appreciate that. So finally, the last thing to say is please join us next time on Wednesday, the 16th of March. We're launching a new translation. It's the Rhapsodies from 1831 by Petrus Borrell, translated by John Gallas and Kurt Gantz. John will be with us on the night, and he will be joined by poet and translator Jenny Lewis, who is also a Carcanet author. So you can check that all out on the website. I'm going to pop the link in the chat for you now. So I hope that we'll see you again. Congratulations to Alison, and happy birthday to Michael also. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.